Okay, so I'm not really going to start off with the situation in Gaza because I'm sure every single one of us has been watching Al Jazeera, watching the news, and there's various different forms, and we know all about the horror about what's happening. We know about the 10,000 plus deaths. I'm not really going to spend much time on that. What I think we need to do is try and understand how we got here. And I think it's important for us to say that when we start off by looking at how we got here, that history didn't start on 7th of October. Although if you were to listen to some Tory ministers or Suella Braverman or whatever, you would think that it did. History in the Middle East started obviously centuries ago, but the relevant history of Palestine started just over 100 years ago. So I'm going to start off by taking us back to the First World War era, because it's crucially important for us to understand what happened at that point. And then I'm going to quite quickly chase through some of the main turning points in Palestinian history and bring us back to where we are at the present. So let me just start off then by going back to taking us back over 100 years to the period just before 1914 and the start of the First World War, where Palestine and the other Arab lands were part of the Ottoman Empire. And there had been struggles by the Arab peoples for their independence or for greater autonomy in the Ottoman Empire, but those had been crushed. 1914 sees the start of the First World War, and on the one side we have got the imperial powers of Russia, France and Britain, and on the other side we've got the imperial powers of Germany, Austro-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, the same Ottoman Empire that is controlling the part of the world we call the Middle East today. And in that mix of that war, there are three agreements or three negotiations that the British get themselves involved in. And those three agreements are vitally important for what they do about the Middle East in the post-First World War era. So let me just take a little bit of time in going through those, because what they show, like many occasions, is that the British state and British imperialism was at the same time playing several different sides off against each other. And the chaos that ensued is a result of what Britain was doing at that particular time. So the three agreements. So first of all, obviously Britain is on the opposite side of the Ottoman Empire. So the first thing that they tried to do is that they tried to make various agreements with the Arab peoples in the Middle East to fight for their own independence in the midst of the First World War and to rise up against the Ottoman Empire. The British haven't really talked much about these, but these are held together in something called the McMahon-Hossan correspondence. McMahon was a British general, and Hossan was the Sharif of Mecca, so an important Arab leader. And basically, McMahon made a promise from the government's point of view, which said that if the Arab peoples were to rise up against the Ottomans and fight with the British in the First World War, then if or when Britain won the First World War, Britain would look favourably upon Arab demands for independence. Now, that's what Britain did. They armed, they incited uprising amongst the Arab people on the promise of recognition or of an Arab state or an Arab land once the war would finish. I'm not going to say much more about that, except that you might have seen the film Lawrence of Arabia, or you might know about Lawrence of Arabia or heard of Lawrence of Arabia. But the story of Lawrence of Arabia is exactly that. That's who he was. He was sent by the British government to foment uprising amongst the Arab peoples during the First World War as a way of defeating the Ottomans. So that's the first agreement. At the same time, the British and the French, so I should say that the McMahon-Hossan correspondence is from 1916. So again, in 1916, there is a second agreement. So this time, the British and the French, with the support of the Russians, the Tsarist regime, the three of them basically sit down in the desert and they produce something that becomes known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Sykes is a British civil servant, Picot is a French civil servant, and the Russians give their support to what the two of them are doing. And basically the two of them are dividing the Middle East between the two of them in the event that the British and the French win the First World War. So in other words, what they would do with Ottoman lands, how they would divide themselves up. And basically, they sat with a ruler. So if you look at the modern map of the North Africa and the Middle East, I always think it's quite remarkable. You might have guessed I come from Scotland. So if I'm coming from Scotland down to England, the border between Scotland and England follows this river, and it goes round this hill, and it's a squiggly line, and that's what borders are like. But if you look at the borders of North Africa and Egypt, they're all straight lines all over the place. You would think that either the rivers are incredibly straight or somebody drew it with a ruler, and it would be the second of those that was right. So the British and the French sat in a tent with a ruler and divvied the world between the two of them, so North Africa and Egypt. In that agreement, they said that Lebanon would go to France, Syria would go to France, Iraq and Iran would come to Britain, Palestine would come to Britain, Saudi would come to Britain, or the parts of the world that would become Saudi would come to Britain, Egypt would come to Britain, Algeria would go to France, Morocco would go to France, Libya would go to France, and that's how they divided the world between the two of them in this agreement, the Sykes-Picot plan for the post-war era. Should say that the reason that the French and the British at this point wanted to divide the Middle East and North Africa between them was for two or three real reasons. The first one is that in 1908, there's a really significant event happens, and that significant event is that the first oil from the Iranian oil fields is brought on stream. And from that point on, oil becomes the most important commodity in the 20th century, in 20th century capitalism. And both the British and the French were trying to get their hands on the oil that was underneath the earth in the modern Middle East. So oil was a driver. And even by the First World War, if you know anything about it, the Royal Navy had changed from coal-powered ships to oil-powered ships. The dreadnoughts were oil-powered. And oil, even during the First World War, was a vital commodity. And it was to become more so during the 20th century. So oil is part of the story. The second part of the story is that the region became important because it shortened the route. If you could control the Middle East, you could shorten the route to Britain and France's imperial crowns. So the imperial crown for Britain was India. Prior to the middle of the 19th century, if you wanted to get to India, you had to leave Britain and the shores of Britain. You sailed down round the Horn of Africa and then all the way back up the other side of Africa to get to India. And it was an exceptionally long journey. In the middle 1860s, the French opened the Suez Canal. So they dug and opened the Suez Canal. And the opening of the Suez Canal cut the travel times from Britain to India and from France to Indochina, so Vietnam and around Vietnam, their important imperial conquests. It cut the time travel dramatically. And what that meant was that the whole Mediterranean region was not only full of oil, but it was also important stop-off and military stop-off points, both for cargo ships going back and forward to India and for military vessels going back and forward to India. So what that meant was that you would sail from Britain and your first stop would be in Gibraltar. So if you think where Gibraltar is, it's actually Spain, but it's still part of Britain, but it's bizarrely where it is. So Gibraltar. And then you would go from Gibraltar along to Malta, which was British. And then you would go from Malta along to Cyprus, where there are still very, very significant military bases in Cyprus. And then from Cyprus, you would then go into Haifa. British sailing ships or the French ships would go into Beirut later on. You would then go into Port Said at the top of Egypt. You would then go through the Suez Canal. When you come out the Suez Canal, you go to Aden, which is in Yemen. And then from Yemen, you go across the Indian Ocean and you're in India. So that route became vitally important as a trade route, as a military route, and control of the Suez Canal was absolutely vital. So the second element why Britain and France wanted control of that, because it was control of the Suez Canal. And the third reason is just really a more general geopolitical reason, that the Middle East and the trade routes that go around there, it meant you could fence in your opponents, whether that is Russia or more laterally today, whether that's China and Russia today. The region is an immensely important strategic importance. And so Britain and France were trying to get their hands on economic resources, strategic resources, and also the economic resources of the Suez Canal that would get you to India. Of course, the Sykes-Picot Agreement is in complete contrast to the promises that were made in the McMahon-Hossan Agreement. And then the third agreement is something that is called the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration is probably the one that people have heard of or know most about. And it's actually the least significant in terms of its size. It's a letter that is written by Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary of the Tory government at the time, the National Government at the time during the First World War. He'd previously been Prime Minister. He was notorious, actually, because when he was Prime Minister, he was the Prime Minister that introduced the first immigration controls into Britain. And the immigration controls that he brought in were specifically to control the migration of Jews fleeing pogroms in what is called the Pale of Settlement, so places like Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Latvia. That section of Europe was called the Pale of Jewish settlement. And the pogroms after the 1905 Russian Revolution, the failed revolution of 1905, the Tsarist government unleashed pogroms against the Jewish population. Jews fled and moved west, and immigration controls were brought in by Balfour to stop Jews coming to Britain. So he was an anti-Semite, and he'd introduced anti-Semitic laws to control Jewish migration to Britain. But in 1917, he signed the Balfour Agreement. And the Balfour Declaration was a declaration by the British government that said that they recognised the rights of the Jewish people to establish a homeland in Palestine. That's more or less all it said. It was very short, very to the point, but it absolutely was another agreement about another promise to another group of people about what was going to happen to this part of the world after the First World War, or from that point forward. Now, to understand the Balfour Agreement, we have to take a wee sidestep, and the sidestep takes us into an understanding of Zionism, and it remains vitally important that we understand Zionism and what it means today. Because the Balfour Declaration was written to the World Zionist Organization by Balfour and the British government. And there is some confusion over what is Zionism, and is it the same as Judaism? And the first thing to say is it absolutely is not. Judaism is a religion. Zionism is a political philosophy of ethno-nationalism. And it's also not the case that Zionism has always been the main current in Jewish communities. Right up until the Second World War, the biggest organizations of Jews in the world, well, the biggest organization of Jews in the world was called the Bund. And it was actually a socialist or a social democratic and a labour organisation that organised in trade unions and socialist and democratic parties and in revolutionary socialist organisations. And the difference between the two of them was really this, that the Bund thought that Jews had the right to live in harmony and in equality, no matter where they settled, with everybody else. But the Zionist philosophy is something different. Zionism was developed by a man called Theodor Herzl. He was the founder of Zionism. And he had been an observer of a trial that took place in France at the end of the 19th century, and it was called the Dreyfus Affair. And Dreyfus was a French military officer, but the French had just been defeated in their local skirmish with Germany. And the French state and the French press and the French politicians were looking for scapegoats. And the scapegoats that they found was Dreyfus. And the key thing about Dreyfus was that he was a Jew. And the French state ran the most disgusting anti-Semitic campaign. And Dreyfus was sent down. He was expelled from the country and sent off to an island for years as being a traitor to the French nation. But it was really just he was scapegoated for being Jewish. Herzl watched that trial, and the conclusion that he drew was that Jews and Gentiles could not live together. And therefore, the future of Jews to avoid anti-Semitism was that they had to establish their own nation. So unlike the Bund, which was for integration, and the Bund, which was for organising alongside other socialists and fighting anti-Semitism, in a strange way, Zionism from the very beginning bowed towards anti-Semitism and said, there's nothing we can do about anti-Semitism except remove us from the places where it might be. So that's the first thing. The second thing about it is that both through Herzl and through the first chair of the World Zionist Organization, a man called Chaim Weizmann, they went out their way to try to accommodate Zionism to the main imperial powers. So they said that Jews and Gentiles can't live together. We need our own land. But what they did was that they went to the Russian court, they went to the German state, they went to the French state, they went to the British state, and they tried to convince each of those that Zionism was, in their terms, a colonial project, an imperial project, something that those imperial powers could make the most of. Send us to a part of the world and we will make it safe for your interests. Now, today you might think that that was always in what we would call Palestine 48 or Palestine, but it wasn't always Palestine that they had as their vision of their homeland. They started off by considering Patagonia. Don't know if you know where Patagonia is, but it's in northern Argentina. And some of the early Zionists left Europe, went to Argentina, went to Patagonia, and today there is a group of people in Patagonia which are called the Judea Gauchos, so the Jewish cowboys. And that was their roots. They were Zionists. They went to colonize Patagonia. They became Jewish cowboys, and they're still there. The other one that they tried to promote was the country that we call the Congo today. So they also tried to say, give us the Congo, and we'll make Africa safe for British interests in the Congo. But that was rejected. And what they decided, or what they came across through Herzl, was that actually it made biblical sense, and it strengthened their case if they said that their homeland should be in Palestine. But it wasn't always inevitably going to be Palestine. But Palestine it was, because they then said, well, this place to miss in the Torah and round Jerusalem, etc. So that's what Zionism was. It then couried up to the main imperial powers. And with the Balfour Declaration, as Britain was the major imperial power, this was seen to be a huge success for the Zionist movement in 1917. First World War finishes, and we now have three different groups, all expecting Britain to deliver on their promises. The Arabs, because we fought with you, we liberated our lands from the Ottoman Empire, therefore you must give us an independent Arab state. The Zionist organisations, you've promised us a home in Palestine, so you must deliver on this. And the reality was that the British and the French at the League of Nations and the Lausanne Conference took place in 1922, they implemented the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So the agreement that they put together in 1916 is basically what happened in the carve-up of North Africa in the Middle East. And what happens to Palestine at that point is it becomes under the British mandate. So Britain has control of Palestine. France has Lebanon, France has Syria, Britain has Iraq, Britain has Saudi Arabia, Britain has Jordan, Britain has Iran, Britain has Egypt, France has Algeria, Morocco, and Libya in that way. So they've carved it up between the two of them, and they either become part of the empire or they become mandates, which means that they have control over those things. So Britain has control over Palestine through the mandate, and what we immediately see is there is an increase in European colonisation of Palestine, so increase of Jewish settlement. It's worth noting that there is the World Zionist Congress set up something called the Jewish National Fund. It's very well funded, and the Jewish National Fund is used to entice and buy land from Arab landlords. So they buy the land in the 20s and 30s. They buy the land, and you might say, well, that's fair. Of course, they were buying it from Arab landlords, right? The Arab ruling elites for good prices. But on that land, there were peasants, Palestinian peasants, who for generations had farmed that land. And when the Zionists took it over, then they'd bought the land, it was theirs, they immediately evicted the Palestinian peasants from their land. So there is, through the 1920s and the 1930s, there is an increasing process of Palestinian peasants being kicked off the land and land being sold by rich Arabs to the Zionist organisations. As the Zionist organisations grow and expand their influence, they also implement two other things. So first of all, through an organisation called the Hizderut. The Hizderut is a trade union organisation, but it's not like any trade union organisation you would know or recognise in Britain. It's a trade union organisation only for Jewish workers that demands that certain jobs are only for Jewish workers. So it's an exclusionary trade union for Jewish workers, and it's for the eviction of Palestinian and Arab workers. And at the same time, there was various organisations which went round the markets, throwing poison and acids on Arab stalls and physically putting up barriers to stop any Jewish settler from buying anything except from a Jewish shop or a Jewish market or a Jewish stall. So in the middle of Palestine, you've got exclusivist labour organisations, and they're also trying to have a consumer boycott, if you like, of any Arab produce and any Arab sellers. And that leads to huge tension during the 1920s. There's an uprising called the Barak Uprising in 1928. Then there's another major uprising, 36-39, of the Palestinians. The second biggest uprising against the British Empire in the interwar period, so Ireland, and then after Ireland there is Palestine for 3 years. And for half of those years, Palestine is liberated in the highlands around places like Tulkarm and Nablus and Jenin. We have an independent Arab council, and the British respond by doing two things. First of all, they arm Jewish settlers. They utilise Jewish settlers to help them in the war against the Palestinians, and they carry out the most barbaric oppression of the Palestinian people. And many of the things that you hear about in Israel today, or Palestine today, started off with the British. So the British were the first ones to use human shields. The British were the first ones to destroy people's homes as a form of collective punishment. The British were the first ones to introduce administrative detention and detention without trial. The British were the first ones to have extensive use of checkpoints across Palestine. All the things that the Palestinians face in Israel today had their roots in specialist military regulations that were put in place by the British between 36 and 39. And at the same time, they armed the Jewish settlers as a paramilitary force to support them in the suppression of the Palestinians. They bombed, they strafed, they used poisonous gas that was fired by the RAF. And eventually by 1939, they had defeated the Great Palestinian Revolt. And the leaders were either executed or they were expelled from Palestine to Madagascar. That has huge significance for what happens next. I'm going to jump quickly because we then have the Second World War, and at the end of the Second World War, Britain still has control of the of Palestine, and it starts to notify the UN that it's going to hand over the mandate to the people that are living in Palestine. And there's two things, of course, that have happened in the intervening years. So the first one is the Holocaust has taken place. So the Holocaust, without doubt, was the most barbaric episode in European history in the 20th century. It was a European problem of anti-Semitism. It was a European problem of anti-Semitism. But of course, the consequences of that at the end of the Second World War were then visited on the Arab peoples of Palestine. And the second thing is that with the end of the Holocaust, with the end of the Second World War, there is a huge increase in European Jewish migration to Palestine and for the hope of safety in Palestine itself. The British say that they're going to move out and they hand over Palestine to the UN. The UN say that their solution to this is that they're going to divide Palestine between two, between a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. The Jewish organisations welcome this because they don't have a state, so they're going to have something that they never had before. And the Palestinians say, why would we negotiate in handing over a big chunk of our state? We're not taking part in this. It's all Palestine. And the consequence was that the UN then entered into negotiation with the Zionist organisations, and they divided Palestine into two. The minority Jewish European settler society were given 55% of Palestine, and the vast majority of the people who lived there before, the Palestinian Arab communities, were given 45%. And in 1947, the UN went to initiate the settlement, the division of Palestine into two. And on the day that the UN Charter came into place, the Israelis launched what they called their War of Independence against the Palestinians, and what the Palestinians called the Nakba, then unrolled. And between 1947 and 1948, there was a process of ethnic cleansing against the Palestinian people right across Palestine. 525 villages were depopulated in the Galilee. Haifa, which was an overwhelmingly Palestinian town, was cleared of Palestinians. Ilan Pappé, in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, gives a description of what happened. He says that they rolled bombs and barrel bombs down from the top of Haifa, down into the Palestinian quarters. The Palestinians fled onto the harbour because they thought they would get some safety there. The Israelis then bombed the harbour so that the blood the sea round the harbour was turned red with the blood of the Palestinians. Just up the coast from Haifa is Akka, and Akka, the Carmeli Brigade, which had just cleared Haifa, then turned put a siege in place in Akka, poisoned the water aquifers, put typhoid in the water so that the people inside had typhoid, and launched all sorts of campaigns to evict the people of Akka. In town after town and village after village, Palestinians were cleansed. In the rural, in the tea village of Tantura, they killed every man, every woman in the village, They buried their bodies. They immediately turned it into a road and a car park and made it a luxury holiday resort, which Tantura is today, and the Palestinians, which they deny happened, but the Palestinian bodies remain underneath the luxury hotels and car parks of Tantura. So town after town, village after village, ethnic cleansing, and born of violence is the Israeli state. Now, I'm running out of time, Rob says to me. So that's the sort of background to where we are up until 47. But there was a couple of other things that we probably need to touch on. So first of all, for the Palestinians, 750,000 Palestinians, so 750,000 Palestinians were displaced in 47-48 and end up living in refugee camps. Refugee camps on the West Bank, because the West Bank the Israelis don't take, that's taken by Jordan. Refugee camps in Gaza, which the Israelis don't take in 47-48, that's taken by Egypt. Or refugee camps in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, and in various other Arab countries. Like all refugees, they left their homes, and pictures that are very similar to what's happening in Gaza today. They fled under bombardment. They took their keys to their home with them. They took their few belongings with them. And they thought that when the war finishes in 6 weeks or 6 months, we'll go back home. 75 years later, they're not allowed to return to their home. And they are refugees. And their children are refugees. And their grandchildren are refugees. So that today, there are 4 million Palestinian refugees living outside of Palestine without the right to return to Palestine. So that was one of the consequences. Second thing to say is that, well, what did the Palestinians do? So first of all, in 47-48, the Palestinians were broken by the defeat of the Nakba, and they'd gone through the heroism of 36-39. So the first response was that they looked towards the strong Arab countries to free them. And there was a slogan that developed: the freedom of Palestine will come through Beirut, Damascus, and Cairo. What they meant at the time was that strong Arab armies and strong Arab leaders will free Palestine militarily. And the person that they particularly looked to was a man called Gamal Nasser in Egypt, the strong leader of Egypt, who had defeated the British, the French, and the Israelis at Suez and all the rest of it. So their hopes were in a strong Arab leader. And this was called Pan-Arabism, that a Pan-Arab army would liberate Palestine. That's really defeated in 1967, because the next thing that happens is that in 1967, Israel launches what's called the Six-Day War against the Palestinians. They sweep through the West Bank and throw the Jordanians out. They sweep through Gaza and throw the Egyptians out. They sweep up north and take the Golan Heights and kick the Syrians out. And they establish the borders of what they would call as Israel today, or we would call Palestine 48, and complete Israeli control after 67. But from the Palestinian perspective, this doesn't really look good, because you expected the strong Arab armies to liberate you, and now Israel's just defeated Egypt, just defeated Syria, just defeated Jordan. So the Pan-Arabist argument is sort of broken. The following year, in 1968, there's a village in the Jordanian Valley called El Karama. And Karama was a village where the Palestinian resistance forces, which were really quite small and quite weak, they were gathered there. And the Israeli army decided that they were super confident. They'd just beaten all the main armies. They were going to sweep into Jordan. They were going to defeat the remnants of the Palestinian resistance, which was very weak anyway, and that would be the end of the Palestinian question. So they line up their tanks and their paratroopers, and they're about to attack Karama. The Jordanian army comes to the village and tells the resistance fighters that they really need to get going, because the Israelis are coming for them. And a man called Yasser Arafat, who wasn't that well known at the time, but Yasser Arafat makes this rousing speech and basically says that the Palestinians have run for too long, so we will go no further. This is our line in the sand, this far and no further, and we will not run anymore. And we will stand and fight. Even if we die, we're going to stand and fight, but we're not running anymore. So his forces are in an organisation called Fatah, and they stay in the village. And there's another organisation called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and they go into the hills round about Karama. And heroically, they fight the full might of the Israeli army. Israel loses 60 tanks in the process. And whatever you think about suicide bombers, they were lost by people strapping themselves with bombs, running at the tanks and blowing themselves in the tanks up. They pushed the Israeli forces back. The PFLP in the hills took on the Israeli paratroopers. And the Israeli army, for the first time, the Israeli army retreated. at Karama. And the consequence was that in the following weeks and months, thousands, literally thousands of young men and women in the refugee camps across the Arab world joined the main paramilitary organisations, the main resistance organisations. Fatah was the biggest recipient of those people. The PFLP was the second biggest. The DFLP was the third. But those organisations grew hugely in size because they seemed to say that by fighting the Israelis, we could rely on ourselves. We don't have to rely on Arab leaders. And from that point, from 68 right through to 82, there was a constant to and flow between the Palestinian resistance and the Israeli forces. That comes to an end in 82. That comes to an end in 82 because the Israelis push into Lebanon, encircle the main resistance organisations in Beirut. They move in up to Beirut really quickly in the matter of a couple of days. And then they're held at Beirut for 64 days by the Palestinian fighters. They fight every house, all the time. Absolutely heroic resistance by the Palestinian fighters. And they force the Israelis to a standstill yet again. At that point, the Americans come in and make a deal. And they say, I'll tell you what, the only way out of this is that we guarantee that we will escort your fighters out of Beirut, and we promise nothing will happen to the refugees who are left here, and Israel will move back. And it's an all signed and sealed delivery. The Palestinian fighters are on ships and sail out of Beirut. The PLO leaves. And the following day, the Israeli armed forces put up lights into the air, flashlights into the air, whatever they're called, flares, that's the word I'm looking for. So they put flares up into the air, and their support army in Lebanon, the Christian Phalange, the fascist organisations, move into two refugee camps, Sabra and Shatila, and carry out the most barbaric destruction of those camps. There's a book by a man called David Huston who describes it in detail and how they used axes to chop babies and women together. There were multiple rapes that took place. You know, many of the stories that you hear now that apparently take place, they happened in Beirut in 1982 by the Israeli and Israeli support forces in the South Lebanese army. This was a huge defeat for the PLO, and the PLO is marginalised by it. And the next uprising of the Palestinians comes in 86, 87 in the form of the First Intifada, and it's quite different. It's not fighters that take on the Israelis, it's the mass Palestinian population. They strike, they demonstrate, they set up schools, they set up welfare organisations, and they're a fundamental challenge to the Israeli state. Again, heroic resistance by ordinary men and women, young and old, gay and straight, Muslim and Christian, white and black, the whole range of any sort of recognised social movement. And they force the Israelis into negotiations. Their actions force the Israelis to the table. And what comes out of that is an agreement that says that Israel will recognise a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And these are called the Oslo Accords. At first, it will just be a Palestinian authority. But after 5 years, we will give the Palestinian Authority complete recognition as a state. And these are the Oslo Accords. Then the First Intifada is called off. And in the early 1990s, the mid-1990s, the Palestinian Authority is brought into place. Of course, the Israelis renege on their agreement. There is no Palestinian state. The Palestinian Authority is reduced to like a local government at best, but with no military control, with no police services except those that they use against the Palestinians themselves. And in this context, you then have the second Intifada and the second uprising that happens from 2002 onwards through to about 2006. So all of this is part of the important background that brings us back to today. For the last 16 years, they have withdrawn from Gaza, but they have laid siege to Gaza. For the last 16 years, with the failures of the Oslo Accord, they have increased their control over the West Bank. They have increased the number of illegal settlements that exist in the West Bank. They have increased the regular shooting, murdering, maiming of Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. You would think that this is a war, that they claim that this is a war between Israel and Hamas, but the reality is, whether you're Hamas or Fatah, whether you're Fatah or the PFLP, whether you're the PFLP or the DFLP, or whether you're not in any brigade but you're just a Palestinian, the reality is that they kill you, they injure you, they imprison you, and that's your life prospects. And all the time trying to put pressure so that people leave voluntarily, and if you leave, you never get back. So this is where we are in terms of the situation. That's the situation before the 7th of October. That's the context within which the 7th of October takes place. And if you don't understand that context, then you don't really understand what was happening. What is happening is that the Palestinians have always been heroic in their right to resist the colonisation of their lands. That has taken various different forms over the last 75 years, but the constant thing is that people resist, and in international law, they have the right to resist their occupation. Of course, saying that doesn't mean that I necessarily support any one organisation over any other, but being a socialist activist in Britain, I think the main enemy is the British Empire and imperialism, and American empire and American imperialism, and the colonisation of Palestine. And the Palestinians have the right to resist, and whatever forms of resistance they choose, that's up to them. It's not really up to me as a case, as something to put forward. So the final thing, I don't know how long I've got, Rob, but if I've got 2 minutes, that long history of oppression and resistance, I think, is one that we want to look at and certainly celebrate the resistance side. But I think we've also got to ask one further question, and that is that we've gone from a position of the great Arab leader will liberate us, and that was broken in 1967. And then we went to the Fedayeen, the fighters, the brigades, they will liberate us. And that was after 1968, but that was broken in 1982 in Beirut. And then we saw a real advance for the first Intifada, and that did get some negotiated settlement, but then the mass movement was broken. And then we've gone to Gaza, and we've got the authority, and here we are just now. So the key question is, well, how can we get freedom for Palestine? And so I'd like to finish just with this, really, and that is that the early slogan of the Pan-Arabist movement, I think it's something about it. They said that the freedom of Palestine will come through Damascus, Beirut, and Cairo. And in a sense, I think that's right. I think the liberation of Palestine will come through Damascus, Beirut, and Cairo, but not in the form of the Egyptian army or the Syrian army or the Lebanese army or the Jordanian army, not in the sense of a strong Arab leader in any of those countries, because that's been a failed strategy before. But the real strategy is with the real power in the Middle East. And the real power in the Middle East is of the power of the Arab working class. In Cairo, there is a massive working class and a working class movement. It runs to the millions. And in 2010, there was the Arab Spring, in which they came very close to overthrowing the Egyptian regime and establishing something better. And it was a beacon across the whole world. So it went from Egypt, it then went through Syria, it went through Libya, and right across the region. The Arab Spring was a hope for a better world, and we came close to winning. And it was built in the back of the strength of a unified and militant Arab working class. Now, we lost the Arab Spring, but we come close to winning. And it seems to me that in the power of the working class movement across that region, there is a power that can confront their own corrupt rulers. The rulers of Egypt, the rulers of Jordan, the rulers of Beirut are corrupt leaders who oppress their own people. And that movement can address them. And in the process, it can address imperialism. And in the process, it can deal with the Zionist entity in their midst. So if we wanted to look for a hopeful future at the present moment, I would look to the Arab working class, because they're the power, they're the social power in that part of the world, which can fundamentally shape the Middle East and bring about it the liberation not only of Palestine, but the liberation of men and women, of gay and straight, of old and young, right across the Arab Middle East.